Our teleconference speaker today is Dr. Peter Fischer, who's currently now at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center in Memphis. He is my predecessor here as the MTAC medical director, has great experience with his training from Vanderbilt undergraduate college to medical school at the University of Cincinnati, and then master's in epidemiology at UT Memphis, then general surgery and critical care, or general surgery at UT Memphis and critical care at the Oregon Health Science Center, which for some of the older in the crowd, he was mentored by Dr. Don Tronky, truly the icon of the development of trauma systems and trauma care in the United States and around the world for sure. Peter's education goes beyond just, and his clinical aspects go beyond just surgery and critical care. He is a EMT paramedic registered. He's also a flight paramedic and also a level 2 firefighter. So I think this lends a lot of credibility to his participation in disasters, as a disaster himself, as some may want to say. But his talk today is on the disaster response, local, regional, and national. Dr. Fischer, take it away.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Can see it, yep.
All right. All right, let's go ahead. So thank you, Dr. Singh, for your introduction. I want to tell you what an honor it is to be back in North Carolina to give this talk, even if it's just virtually. As Dr. Singh said, I kind of want to go through a little bit of my history and kind of, where I started. So I started in 1997 as a basic EMT. In 1999, I got my volunteer firefighter and became an EMT intermediate. In 2000, became a firefighter 1. And in 2001 became a paramedic. So in 2000 was also when I started medical school. So that was an interesting year. It was a very busy year for the first.
Turn it up. I don't know if I can get the sound up here.
It was a very busy first 2 years of medical schools. We did everything else. In 2004, I started my residency here at the University of Tennessee in Memphis. And in 2006, joined Hernando Fire and Rescue. So while I was a resident, I was working, moonlighting down as a paramedic for Hernando Fire and Rescue, which is about 10 miles south here of Memphis. There's something to be said and fantastic actually about dropping off a patient at your own institution. And then you get to go back to bed while they deal with the disaster. In 2012, I was lucky enough to join this prestigious group at what was then Carolinas Medical Center. Had a fantastic time there and learned a ton. I actually lived in Davidson, North Carolina, which is, as you all know, a little bit north of Charlotte, and was a member of the Davidson Fire and Rescue Department there. In 2016, I went to the Elvis Presley Trauma Center here in Memphis, Tennessee. This is where I trained, so came back here. And also in 2016, joined Tennessee Task Force 1. In 2018, I became the medical director of the Hospital Wing Air Ambulance, which is our local helicopter service, and was really lucky enough to negotiate such that on Mondays, I'm on the flight crew. So every Monday I fly from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. I fly. So I sit at the hangar and do charts and do PI and everything else like that, and then go out as a member of the flight crew every Monday, which is a very unique opportunity for a surgeon to do, and something that I've thoroughly enjoyed. We are going to talk a lot about national, local, and disaster response, but these are the new guideline for field triage of injured patients. I follow the MTAC LinkedIn page. I know you guys have seen this. This has been the last 3 years of my life, has been working on these national field triage guidelines. So I hope everyone's aware of them. I hope you've seen them. If you haven't, here's the website to go to. I would highly recommend that you read the manuscript that's associated with these field triage guidelines. But again, a ton of work has been done to create these guidelines, and we're very excited about them. And these do replace the 2011 field triage guidelines. So let's talk a little bit about kind of national response framework and then national disaster response. So this is the national response framework. And if you really want some great reading to go to bed, I would highly recommend that you start to read this. But this is really, how do we stabilize the incident? What are the things that are needed for any local response that you can do to stabilize any sort of disaster? So, and that's safety and security, food, water, and shelter, health and medical. How do you restore energy? How do you restore communications? How do you restore the transportation network? And how do you deal with hazardous materials? And these are the community lifelines that actually will stabilize an incident. And you'll see on the next slide, but incident stabilization is by far the most important thing to do in the initial stage. These pictures were taken from one of our responses. This is Hurricane Michael that hit kind of the Mexico beach area of Florida. And really looking down at the graph at the bottom, preparedness is always important, but then you have to respond. And again, the preparedness and all the way up to kind of the weeks and months relies on that national response framework. So we're talking short-term response, which is in the days, and then intermediate response, and then weeks to months. And then we need to move to the next phase of a disaster, which is really the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And that obviously is months to years, depending on the level of the disaster. In any disaster response, it's ESF, which stands for Emergency Support Functions. These are the emergency support functions which are critical to any disaster response. You can see them here listed on the left side of your screen. What I do, and what we'll get into a little bit more, is I'm an ESF 9, which is in search and rescue. But you'll see everything's there from agriculture to transportation to communications. And then the picture on the other side of the screen is from the Surfside collapse in Miami, outside of Miami. If you go into an incident command center, you'll see usually all these ESF functions kind of posted above the specific station in a large incident command center. And then we get into the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And again, this is weeks to months or years, depending on the level of disaster. But a really essential element of that is the data that you get during the disaster itself. So while I'm in the ESF 9, which is a majority of what we do is search and rescue, we do a ton of data collection, which is really through surveying the disaster as we go, as you clear areas to look for victims. You'll also try to collect data on the degree of the disaster to shape the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And these principles are a little bit different. As you can tell, these are a lot of local efforts that are going to get in, the pre-disaster recovery planning, a lot of private and public partnerships, again, resilience and sustainability, and how do you make the population or your city or your area or your hospital ready to recover from a disaster. And it's really important that really kind of that's local control more than really national control. This very confusing slide is really just to point out how confusing and difficult it can be to actually start a national disaster recovery or to start resources heading your way. This is Robert Stafford. He's a Republican from Vermont, and he kind of created the Stafford Act in 1988. And again, this is how does a disaster get declared, and then what happens when a disaster gets declared. So really what has to happen is that your local government, whoever that is, if that's Charlotte, if that's Memphis, has to say this is too big for us. And then they go to the state. And the state says, okay, well, we're going to send all these resources. And then the state says, you know what, that's too big for us. And then they're going to make a request to the federal government for more resources. When that happens, then you can get the Department of Health and Human Services and combined with the Department of Homeland Security to declare a disaster. That opens up a whole lot of federal money and a whole lot of federal funding for the national disaster response. But obviously that takes time. So it takes time to actually push it all the way up from the local level to the state level and subsequently up to the national level. Everyone should be aware of the National Incident Management System, or NIMS is what this is, but this is extremely important. And these sections underneath the incident commander do not change. So there's an operations area, there's a planning section, a logistics section, and a finance or administrative section. Those areas do not change, and this is part of every incident commander's goal. An incident commander is part of again, that can be a national response or that can be a local response. And the incident command system has really set the stage for a lot of what we do in disaster response, and that's everything from, you know, a local fire. For example, the incident commander gets on scene, they make an assessment, they start setting up these sections, and away you'll go from just handling one fire all the way up to handling a national disaster. Now, there's a lot of different parts of national disaster response. The National Disaster Medical System, or NDMS, sits within the Department of Health and Human Services under the ASPR, or the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response. That's a lot of NDMS, ASPR, it's a lot of acronyms, but again, ASPR you'll hear a lot. There's a lot of federal funds around ASPR. So ASPR you'll see a lot, and this is the NDMS. The NDMS system really consists of 5 different branches, and this is the disaster medical assistant teams. You saw a lot of these activated in COVID, and these were teams that went to specific hospitals to try and undo the burden of that COVID was occurring. There is a specific branch, which are the trauma and critical care teams. These are more focused towards, obviously, disasters that would require a very significant surgical component. There's disaster mortuary operations teams, which are extremely important, obviously, to control those who are deceased in the incident, the victim information center teams, and the national veterinary response teams. And again, these lie in the Department of Health and Human Services, DHSS, under the Assistant Secretary to Preparedness and Response. There is a small branch called the International Medical Surgical Response Teams, the ISURT teams. There's 2 of these. There's based out of Seattle, and there's one based out of Miami. These teams will respond to surgical disasters internationally. Last time I think that they were deployed and utilized was the earthquakes in Haiti. And so not deployed very often, but they will get deployed at sometimes to deal with, again, international disasters that require a significant surgical response. All right, let's see, let's hope this works.
Parker barely by inches just misses a home run. Candy Maldonado with the hesitation, allowing Jose Canseco to score, and he fails to get Dave Parker at second base, so the Oakland A's take.
I'll tell you what, we have another.
All right, I'm going to call out Dr. Singh. Dr. Singh, were you watching that baseball game? Do you remember what that was?
That was a World Series, and then was that the one the lights went out?
That was the World Series. That was the, and I don't know if you guys could hear the sound, but that was
the earthquake.
Yep, the Game 3 series of the, that was the Oakland A's versus the San Francisco Giants, Game 3, Candlestick Park in 1989. I remember I was a kid, so that made Sing like 50 years old when he was watching it. And, you know, I was watching this with my dad, and I remember that, I mean, there were literally people passing kids onto the field because they didn't know if the stadium was going to collapse or not, and a lot of confusion when it started. But it was the Loma Prieta earthquake. It happened October 17th of 1989 at 5:04 p.m. It was a very large earthquake, 6.9 magnitude, 63 deaths, and almost 4,000 injuries. This is where the majority of the deaths occurred. This was the Cypress Freeway collapse. This is a 1.6 mile long stretch of freeway. It was 4 lanes on each level, and it obviously collapsed and pancaked on top of each other. You can see from the picture in the bottom, you know, if there's a person trapped in that car, how do you get that person out? What are your local resources that are going to be able to get that person out? And obviously the local resources are going to be quickly overwhelmed. Most likely, a lot more people would have been killed had the World Series not been going on at the time. The freeway was actually fairly empty, especially for rush hour, because of the World Series game. But the reason I bring that up is that really started the National USAR response system, which is, again, this is what I'm part of, which is the National Urban Search and Rescue Response System. I'm a member of the Tennessee Task Force 1, and that's part of our section down there. USAR started really in 1964. This was the Prince William Sound earthquake up in Alaska, and it led to the Earthquake Hazards Reduction Act of 1977. And this really led to the fact that earthquakes are a large enough event that occurs that it quickly, if a big one happens, it very quickly overwhelms the local resources. And therefore you need resources from somewhere else to be coming into here. This earthquake that occurred in 1964 in Alaska, they really were on their own. There was no kind of national response. In 1985, the Mexico City earthquake occurred, and there were 2 fire departments that had a USAR branch, an urban search and rescue branch, that responded subsequently to those. So Fairfax County out of Virginia and Metro-Dade out of Florida, urban search and rescue teams went to these earthquakes and provided a great deal of assistance. Again, the Lone Creator earthquake in 1989 kind of sparked the United States Government's Act, and then in 1992, the Federal Response Plan happened, which set up the USAR system. And again, in 2001, it was mitigated after 9/11 for the all hazards response and the National Incident Management System. These are the locations. There are 28 task force teams in the country. You can tell their locations are kind of spread a little bit out through the middle of the United States, a lot in California. Again, it was these task forces were started out of earthquake response, so a lot in California, and a little bit of concentration up in the Northeast. What is a task force? So this is what a task force is. So when we go on a type 1 deployment, there's a task force leader, and then the branches of that are the search teams. There's a very significant heavy rescue component, which consists of rescue specialists as well as a rescue officer in each. Obviously, a pretty significant canine response, up to 4 to 5 to 6 dogs. And those are both cadaver dogs as well as live response dogs. A hazardous materials team, a medical team. The medical team consists of, for a type 1 deployment, 2 physicians and then 4 paramedics. Logistics team manager, again, 2 of these, and then a number of specialists, and then a plans team manager as well as a number of specialists. And the goal with this, again, 2 physicians is to really, so we can do 24/7 operations. So again, you can split it in half, and you got 35 people working during the day and 35 people working at night. Again, majority of this is really focused on search and rescue. The rescue team managers are all 95% of the team is fire department personnel. Very few civilians that come in and with the goal to really rescue people and respond again to that earthquakes. How do you break the concrete? How do you stabilize the car? How do you get the patient out of that car that's collapsed underneath the bridge, etc. A type 3 deployment really just cuts it in half. And a lot of times with a type 3 deployment, you'll join another team. So again, it'll be Tennessee Task Force 1 will be paired with Indiana Task Force 1. Tennessee Task Force 1 is going to take the daytime operations. Indiana is going to take the nighttime operations. FEMA has, over time, started using these type 4 deployments, which are really hazard specific. So again, if you are responding to an incident that is going to require a lot of swift water rescue, you don't necessarily need to bring all of your structural collapse equipment. And so because of that, these are the kind of mission specific response teams. What's the capability of the urban search and rescue teams? This is, again, it's the goal is for the team to be out the door and rolling within 4 hours of deployment. So the goals, did it stop sharing? Am I still sharing?
Nice.
How do I switch the audio to?
Dr. Fisher, we lost your sharing.
Okay.
This is still a little bit.
I think the conference room like kicked you out somehow. If you guys could stop sharing.
All right. Can you see my presentation again?
Yeah, you're back.
I'm back.
I got it.
All right. So we're back. So the capabilities of the USAR response system is really a 4-hour deployment from time of activation. So the goal is, again, for all of these 80 personnel to be rolling within 4 hours of activation. I can tell you that's almost impossible. It's extremely difficult to get rolling within 4 hours. If you're flying by air, you get 6-hour deployment time. It's very rare for us to fly by air. It's a lot of equipment and a lot of people to fly by air. Then again, we have had to go to Key West for Hurricane Maria, and that was a fly by air. So all this has to be loaded onto like a C-130 and moved out. Again, 24-hour operations, 72 hours of self-sufficiency. So the team has to be able to completely be self-sufficient for 72 hours. That's water, that's food, that's hygiene issues, air conditioning, shelter, et cetera, for 72 hours. And a 10-day mission capability. That 10-day easily gets extended to 14 to 16 to 18 days if need be. Deployment tasks, well, that's everything underneath the sun. Again, these were originally developed for structural collapse. And again, as times have mitigated on, there's the need for structural collapse wasn't as strong. And with 9/11, obviously, and the All Hazards Act, the mission has changed dramatically. So reconnaissance, wide area search and technical search, extrication of trapped survivors, which was really the original mission, structural and hazard evaluation of buildings. We do deploy with 2 civil engineers. Hazardous materials, operations in water inundated areas. Again, a lot of that was out of Katrina to increase the water capability. Operations in hazmat, biologic, radiological, nuclear, and explosive environments. Emergency medical care of system personnel, canines and trapped survivors, and evacuation. Tennessee is interesting. Memphis, if you saw on that map, sits in the corner. We sit very central in the United States, and because of that, we're deployed often. We're probably one of the most deployed teams in the country. You can see here the deployments all from 1996 moving forward. Last year, for example, we went to Hurricane Ida, Surfside collapse, and the Mayfield, Kentucky tornadoes that occurred. And again, you can see in 2020 was extremely busy. Tropical cyclones Laura, Sally, Beta, Delta, Zeta. And then the Oregon and the wildfires in Oregon, we sent a canine detachment. Here are some pictures from some of the responses. Again, up in your left-hand corner is the Surfside collapse. A number of task force teams were deployed there, and again, that was really the structural collapse. To the right top is and right bottom is the Mayfield, Kentucky tornadoes. This was an interesting response. I mean, it was a tragic response. Up there in the top is the Candlestick Factory. The devastation that you saw actually in person was way more than I think you could ever even ideally, see on the news. It was very impressive, the amount of destruction and damage that occurred there. On the bottom left, you'll see the Fire Department of Memphis vehicle, and then if you can see also attached is the Florida Task Force 1. So this was an interesting deployment. This was if you can imagine the civilian positions, especially the engineers and the physicians, are by far the hardest positions to fill. And if a physician is not available, the entire team will be stopped. So again, if you're deploying with 80 people and you don't have 2 positions that can go, the team does not deploy. It is undeployable. So this was actually, I was deployed with Florida Task Force 1. So I actually joined Florida Task Force 1, which is the team out of Miami-Dade. I drove about halfway and met them, and then all of a sudden they were mission capable with the physician, and we went on to what we needed to do. But it was that was an interesting deployment, and I think as times move on, we're going to see more and more of that to be able to get teams together. So what do I do? And so I'm a medical team manager. My primary mission on the team is the primary really care of the team. So the medical component of a task force team's primary mission is to take care of the team, and that's humans and canines. I've had a whopping 4 hours of canine training, so obviously I'm extremely capable of doing that. But thank goodness there's usually some veterinarians around somewhere in the response. And really our secondary mission is care of the victims. Obviously we're going to care for people that we find and everything else like that again, but the primary goal of this response and the medical component of the USAR teams is the care of the medical team of the care so that the search and rescue operations can continue. Obviously for the medical team manager, you have to be a physician, and then these are a number of the other courses, so respiratory operations, rope, swift water, trench, hazmat, vehicle extrication, structural collapse, medical specialist course, etc. With my background in pre-hospital care, this was a very nice kind of leeway into this, and in all honesty, most of the training requirements were done by the time I started. The medical specialist course, this was a lot of fun. I was lucky enough to do my medical specialist course up in Randall's Island, which is the FDNY training facility. And this is not necessarily, they don't teach you medicine because you're supposed to know the medicine already. This is, how do you care for the victim in the austere environment? How do you intubate somebody upside down in a tunnel? How do you do a field amputation, etc.? and you know, how do you work really as a team and what your paramedics can do, et cetera. This is the bottom picture was the end of our class. It was a nighttime operation. That's the rubble pile. That's actually the New York Police Department's rubble pile that they train on. They had victims spread out throughout. They made it extremely realistic. They actually had the air rescue teams flying overhead at low altitude to make it really loud and pushing lights everywhere and everything else like that. It was a great training course and very realistic. Again, this is more of the Randall's Island facility. If you ever have the opportunity to see it, it's a wonderful training facility. Obviously, New York has a lot of resources. The building on the far right on the top picture actually has different floors that they can actually control, like to mimic a pancake collapse. And they can say, you know, we'll put the third floor 1 foot above the second floor or move it up, et cetera. So a great training facility. Again, this is part of the canine training. The canine training, again, the canines obviously are extremely well trained. There's a ton of money in the canines with the amount of training that's required for the canines, and obviously a huge resource and a very important resource to the teams. So again, you're taught how to intubate a dog. You're taught how to again, this is on the right side. This is how to take a dog, an injured dog, off of a rubble pile effectively, and how do you evacuate a canine. These are some pictures from, this is actually a training facility up in Muscatatuck, Indiana. This is kind of a disaster town, or is what they call it. But this literally are the moulages and everything that's set up. This is a joint military and civilian training facility for disaster response. You can see a lot of training in both water operations. They have a flooded kind of village there, as well as a lot of structural capability and structural response. This is again out of that same ORE, or that operational exercise. Obviously a lot of military partnerships. And again, in a disaster situation, usually it's a lot of National Guard and military partnerships. So you have to be able to, how do you train together? How do you function together? This is one of our dogs. I never really thought about it, but how do you convince a search dog to get on a really loud helicopter? And that's one of the ways. And again, more training throughout of this. It was a really great opportunity to go up there. It was, we were eating MREs and everything else at the same time. So, well, we ate a lot of MREs, but then again, the medical team snuck out and went to Dairy Queen because we were just exhausted from it. So, this is our deployment. This is what a deployment looks like. So a deployment is about, it's about 10 to 15 vehicles, including 2 semis. On the right side are my go bags. This sits in my guest room. My wife loves the fact that this sits in our guest room closet, but these, they're packed, they're ready to go, and you got to be able to leave on a moment's notice for up to 2 weeks time. This is again what we deploy with, which is 2 semi-trailers, 2 soft-sided trailers, again, more trailers, utility vehicles, 3 box trucks, excursion, 5 pickup trucks, 4 boats, 2 forklifts, everything else like that, 2 big buses full of personnel. Deployments can be difficult, to say the least. Again, you're leaving your family at a kind of a moment's notice that you're going to have to leave your family for up to 10 days to 2 weeks. This is my boys and I right before, I can't remember what deployment that was for. Top right corner was Hurricane Dorian. We had about 8 teams that were all shoved in the Orlando Convention Center, and that's where they staged us. If you can imagine, this is a ton of people sleeping in a very small space. There were at one point, I think, as many as 500 people that were at the Orlando Convention Center, and there were 2 showers for those 500. So it was, you literally had to wake up at like 3 o'clock in the morning for your shower time. To be able to do that. We spend a lot of time in gymnasiums. And the reason for this is that they try really hard in the National Disaster Framework to make sure that the hotels are available for the evacuating personnel. So you want hotels available for the evacuating personnel, or not evacuating civilians, and you put us in convention centers and gymnasiums. And then obviously if you're deploying downrange, you have the capability for a whole bunch of Western shelter tents, et cetera. To kind of live downrange. What's the cost of a deployment? We are not volunteers. Everybody on the team gets paid. Everybody gets paid for the time that they're there. Also, for the fire department personnel, the disaster pays for their backfill. So if you're a firefighter who's leaving for deployment, obviously you're leaving your shift, and the federal response actually pays for someone to backfill your shift. But it's about $100,000 a day for one team. So again, most of that's personnel costs, again, because of, just you're taking 80 people away. So that's almost $500,000 in that. From an equipment standpoint, and again, this is we have all the equipment. So this isn't new stuff. This is disposable equipment that's bought. It's $98,000. We take one of the biggest cost items for any deployment is the medications that we take with us. Our medical cache has about $50,000 worth of drugs in it. And unfortunately, because you're taking those drugs to an austere environment, you're not allowed to redeploy those drugs. So once they're taken away, and those drugs actually live within the pharmacy of the hospital that I work at, always prepared, always in a box, actually in like 4 boxes ready to go. But once those leave the hospital doesn't take them back. So about $50,000 of that is the medications alone. And then a significant number, obviously, of administrative costs to get this many people out the door, and then how do you pay for it, et cetera. Because, in all honesty, a lot of times, because the big teams, the 28 big teams are so expensive, you've seen a rise now of these regional or state responses. This, for example, is Tennessee Task Force 2, which sits out of Nashville. They're a state team. So a state team mirrors FEMA task forces, and they do really good work, but they're smaller, they're extremely less expensive, and their training requirements are extremely less. So we've seen a lot of transition to a lot of use of these state teams. And the state teams really, again, they provide a good resource, but a lot of times they're utilized really just because they're less expensive. Again, a lot of military and civilian partnership. If you notice, the Western Shelter on the top right has an MTAC logo on the very top of it. This is a drill that we did in Charlotte in collaboration with the National Guard. That's when I was at Carolinas Medical Center. This was with the National Guard, and this was how do you evacuate. This was the scenario was that these people were arriving by C-130 and they had been evacuated from a disaster zone. And then how do you re-triage them and put them back into a medical system? Good drill, again, really highlights the military and the civilian partnership if this is going to work. I did want to talk a little bit about the civilian response. So civilian response is extremely important. And, I think one of the best examples of this is the Cajun Navy. A little shout out to John Green for his Cajuns. But the Cajun Navy is a great example of civilian response, and they do amazing work. They do really good things, and they do a lot of really good things not tied down by the bureaucracy of the government. So again, we talked a little bit about before how difficult it is necessarily to get the national resources moving, right? So local has to say we're overwhelmed. Then the state has to say we're overwhelmed, and then you got to activate the national disaster system, and then you got to feed it back down to get the resources needed. I think one of the best examples of that is the Mayfield, Kentucky tornadoes. The Mayfield, Kentucky tornadoes occurred Friday night into Saturday morning. Obviously, significant devastation that you saw. On Saturday, I was sitting there and I was waiting for the phone call. I was like, there's no way we're not getting deployed to this. We're only about 3-4 hours away. We got to go. There's no doubt about it. And on Saturday afternoon, we got a text message from the team that said Indiana Task Force 1 got deployed. That's the only people that are getting deployed. Everybody can stand down, calm down. You're not leaving. So anyway, I go about my Sunday, play a nice round of golf on Sunday. It was Mother's Day, I think, actually. And no, it wasn't Mother's Day. It was it was something with the family that was important. And then at 6 p.m., I got a call that said we got to leave in 2 hours. So that's the kind of FEMA at its finest. Kind of the hurry up and wait, and we're the government, and we're here to help. And so you have to get. We were really late in that deployment. We should have been deployed about 24 hours earlier. The civilian response team obviously doesn't need to deal with that. They're all volunteers. Obviously, there's some training concerns sometimes when they come out, but again, they do great things. And again, you got to highlight the Cajun Navy and what they do. So what about local response? How do we take these lessons that we've learned from the national response and then take them to your local level? And obviously one of the most important things is to do a risk assessment. So, what's the most likely to occur and what's going to have the most severe impact on your hospital or your local jurisdiction or what's there? In Memphis, Tennessee, I don't necessarily need to prepare for a nuclear meltdown, but if you're in Charlotte with Lake Norman and stuff sitting up there, maybe you do. But so that's kind of, the risk assessment is really important. For us here in Memphis, it was really, when I first got here, it was how do we handle the mass surge event? I'm in a hospital which is extremely low resource. It's a county hospital. We run at about 110% capacity every single day. And how do we handle a mass surge of patients? And mass surge and disaster response has changed dramatically over the past 20 to 30 years. On the left is the plane crash that occurred in San Francisco. That was where they landed short of the runway. But that's what we always were prepared for. All scenarios seem to always be the plane crash. That's what we're planning for, or the building collapse. Well, in those situations, you really have about an hour to set up, right? I mean, by the time that first units get on scene, they really start to stabilize the incident, they start to transport the victims. The hospital itself really has probably got about an hour to have a nice response. You're going to get more people in, you're going to get your people in place and everything else like that. Unfortunately, with the mass shootings, that's changed dramatically. And on your right, what you'll see is that was from the Pulse nightclub shooting. And I use the Pulse nightclub shooting as a really big example. And this is when we do local kind of disaster response or mass surge response at my own hospital, this is the example that I always use. The Pulse nightclub shooting, if you look at it, was 107 victims, 49 were killed, 58 were wounded. But it occurred within sight of Orlando Regional Medical Center, which is the trauma center. So on the bottom picture, if you look at, that's the Pulse nightclub there, where you see in the forefront all the flowers and everything else like that. Immediately down the road, about a mile away, is Orlando Regional Medical Center, which is the trauma center. And if you remember from the last picture I showed you, that the initial evacuation of victims is not by EMS. Your initial evacuation of victims, especially in a mass shooting, is by civilians. And so Orlando Regional learned of the mass shooting not by some big coordinated disaster response system, but rather by the first victims to start to show up. And they got 38 patients within the first 42 minutes of the incident. And so I think what's really important, and was really important here, was to realize that how important that is to the system and how well will your hospital or your local response handle that. I can tell you when I got here, this was kind of the mass surge plan. It was kind of written on the back of a cocktail napkin. The Regional 1 mass surge plan was come to the hospital and do something. And that really was not an appropriate response plan. So we spent the last really 4 years really working on this plan. Now we have procedure checklists. This is, for example, for one med surge floor. Exactly what are they going to do and what are you going to do in a mass surge? And then we've kind of, as we've evolved, put into hazmat, we've added some hazmat, and we'll continue to kind of move on these plans as we move together. Again, you set up all these things and you're like, are we ever going to actually use it? Well, I mean, you have to drill. It's really important to drill, and it's really important to drill with live people. These are high school students, and it was, we always talked about, well, we need to evacuate the emergency departments immediately. Where are we going to move these people? How are we going to move these people? You can't say, well, this ventilated patient that I've got holding in my emergency department waiting on an ICU bed can be transported by the housekeeper, because they can't. They're going to need a nurse and they're going to need a respiratory therapist to be able to get them out of the emergency department and somewhere else. And then kind of the unthinkable kind of happens.
Thursday afternoon.
There it is, a shooting with injuries. No further information this time. Cargill's on the scene now. First thing, dispatch. You said this is at the Kroger?
Check it is in the Kroger in Collierville, 240 New Byhalia Road.
7300 en route. Task force cars, get en route.
240 New Byhalia in Collierville, they have
44.
So this is kind of the, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the mouth. This is, you never thought you'd be quoting Tyson, but this is an unbelievable appropriate comment, right? So it's important to plan, it's important to prepare, but you have to realize that that plan will be completely lost and completely destroyed, usually within about the first 5 to 10 minutes of the incident. And so the ability, part of your planning has to be the ability to be flexible and adjust. This was the text thread. In COVID, it was interesting. All the medical directors of all the emergency departments, including the trauma medical director, started kind of this big group text thread to kind of help handle the surge of patients during COVID, and where we could put patients and everything else like that. And that was one of the really good things that COVID led to, was a better collaboration than we've ever seen among we have really 4 competing hospital systems in town, that, at least on the medical director side, really started to work well together. This was the text thread that was going around during the disaster. I was actually assigned to one of the medical helicopters. I found out about the mass shooting, and again, this was an active shooter event in Collierville, which is about 10 miles north of Memphis. I found out about the event because I got dispatched to the event. So they said, we got dispatched to the event. We've got approximately, at that time it was very early, so they said about 30 victims of gunshot wounds, and they were dispatching every resource that they could possibly find to the scene. My helicopter was a little late getting out of the hangar or getting up in the air. Really more than anything else is because I had to activate the system. Since I was the first to know, we had to activate the system at our current level. In all actuality, I knew that my local disaster person was in a meeting with the CEO, so I called the CEO's office. I said, you got to interrupt that meeting and get them out of there to activate our disaster response plan, and we did. I actually flew to the scene of that. By the time I even got to the scene of that, the majority of the patients had already been evacuated, which was exactly what should have happened. I was extremely proud of our response. We did a great job. We took care of the most critically injured patients, and really everybody pulled together. But I think, part of this is really to kind of highlight, and this has been shown in disaster response after disaster response, that you can have a plan, but it's so important to have those relationships, and you need to have made those relationships before the disaster to occur. So who are your local relationships? Again, MTAC is a great example of that. How do you work within a RAC system to start to realize and know the connections and say, okay, I got to, these 10 patients that I have at Carolinas Medical Center need to go somewhere else. Where else can they go? Who's at Gastonia that has the cell phone number that I know that I can help get those patients up there? You're going to start to see more and more of this as the time goes on. The American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma has really started to push the Regional Medical Operations Center, or the RMOC concept. And you're going to start to see more and more push as we move forward with disaster response as we go through. So really, in conclusion, I think prepare, right? And you got to prepare, but you also got to know that your plan is not going to work. It's going to work for about the first 5 minutes, and then you got to adapt. I really want to continue to push, and if there's any residents on here, I gave this as a grand rounds at my local place. Again, this was really more to the residents than anything else, is that surgeons have a role in the pre-hospital environment. Surgeons have a role in the disaster response. That I really want to advocate for surgeons to stay involved in those fields. A lot of times we've given up on that, and again, I love my emergency medicine colleagues. I think I saw Dr. Gibbs on, everything else like that, but I want surgeons still to play a role, especially nationally. So I want to thank everybody. It's been great to be back. This is the Elvis Presley Trauma Center. If anybody wants to come visit, you're more than welcome to. I cannot thank all of y'all enough for my time at Carolinas. This is a great honor to be back giving this talk, and obviously had an amazing time in Charlotte, and made some amazing relationships, and obviously learned a ton. Everyone here has taught me a ton, and I greatly appreciate that, and think about y'all every day and miss you drastically. It's amazing how fast 6 years can go by. So this was a picture of my 2 kids when on the day that we left North Carolina, and there they are now, dropping them off at camp. So 6 years flies by. And again, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to give this talk. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Tremendous talk, Peter. I'm sure we'll have a bunch of questions, but I have a couple of quick ones to start off with. You know, one of the challenges with a disaster preparedness is frequently on the provider side, the front end of this is commonly voluntary participation, like our state medical assistant team issues we have. So how do you continue to invigorate disaster preparedness when there is not a preparedness in an essentially volunteer situation? Because every level, from the physicians through administration to the first responders, really all have to participate in this for any meaningful collaboration to occur when the event does occur.
Yeah, and I think that volunteerism in America is a much more difficult thing than it used to be. And I mean, you see that even on the volunteer fire departments that used to exist, that a lot of times tones are going off and just nobody's responding. And the volunteer effort is extremely more difficult. And I think what you really have to do is you have to, unfortunately, capitalize sometimes on bad things that occur. So something bad that occurs usually invigorates participation, and you got to capitalize on that and say, how do we do this better? How do we respond? The more drills that you can do, I think, helps tremendously. And the drills, and again, not tabletop drills, but drills with real moulage, high school students, et cetera. Because people think I think people get the realism a little bit more with that. Again, the longer you wait between one event to the next, obviously the worse you are at it, unless you've drilled in between. So we gotta continue to work on that.
Any questions out there in the audience? I don't want to dominate the scene here. So,
Peter, great talk. Peter had a question.
Go ahead.
Hey, this is Sam Ross. So you mentioned at the end the coordination with the regions and the regional operation command centers. How do you go about setting that up in your own state and your own region to get those kind of up and rolling without funding?
Yeah, I mean, you guys have already got it, right? So North Carolina is actually way ahead of Tennessee, for example, which is you already have at least your region set up. And you have the basics of MTAC already there. It's how do you take MTAC, which again, the Metro Carolina Trauma Advisory Committee, and really focus it on sort of any medical disaster response or any sort of local response. I think that's kind of where you could take the basics of MTAC and then or the basics of the RAC system anywhere in North Carolina, and really kind of, again, get your administrators more involved and get everybody more involved as you move forward. Again, funding is going to be a huge important part of this. And this is where we're pushing kind of on the national level to get more and more funding available to set these up. I think that's kind of where it's going to be, hopefully with the college's support, and then the Department of Health and Human Services has really caught on to this, and we'll continue to push these on the national level to get the funding and stuff set up.
Hey, Peter, it's Brad. That was a great talk. Going from the napkin readiness to where you are now, I'm curious what it looks like today in your hospital. How often are you guys drilling and, meeting, and what do your plans look like for mass casualty?
So right now we meet monthly. Our goal is that we've made it simplistic enough so that, again, that checklist sits at every kind of nurse's station, and it's the red notebook. And the goal with that is that if you've been the goal with this checklist is it's so simple that if you've been a nurse, for one day at our institution, you'll be able to follow the steps of that to be able to at least get the initial response done. And again, I'll be the first to tell you that we're really focused on that initial response of, minute 0 to hour 4, 5, 6. And our next step as we move forward is how do we do that sustained response for within days? How do you sustain that level of readiness? Brad, one of the things that we worked really hard on, which is, how do we evacuate our areas where we our intake areas where we're holding, I mean, I don't know. I mean, we hold patients for forever in the emergency department setting just because we don't have the inpatient beds for them to move to. How do we clear those areas and get them moving? And that's kind of I think the biggest part of that is to drill it and to get everybody involved. If again, I wasn't at my hospital when the Collierville shooting occurred. I was actually on the way to the scene, but my CEO was out directing traffic. He was out directing traffic to clear the road for another helipad. It's interesting that my hospital has one helipad that sits on the roof, but we had 8 helicopters getting dispatched to the scene. So we had to clear our secondary landing zone, which is actually the street in front of the hospital, and get that open for more helicopters to come in. So it's with COVID now, the drills are a little bit harder. We do one citywide drill where we actually get everybody involved, all hospitals and everything else involved. And then our goal is at least every 2 months to have some sort of local hospital drill. And that local hospital drill can be a big drill, or it can literally consist of my emergency manager walking up to 5D, which is one of my inpatient floors, and says, all right, get out your notebooks and do what you're supposed to do. And just to the point of trying to clear that up and get that moving.
Dr. Fischer, on that note, training is crucial, but we're facing historic patient censuses. How do you find the time or the administrative buy-in when we're boarding patients at all of our hospitals and all of our EMS agencies are maxed out? How do you do these drills when you're taking care of real patients?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hardest part is that we're lucky enough, at least with the citywide drill, that again, that we're a county hospital, so we don't have a choice, right? We're going to participate in the citywide drill. In all actuality, boarding the patients can actually help you because then those are your patients that you can actually move around to kind of help actually simulate the real disaster. We've been very lucky with administrative buy-in. Then again, I'm not going to lie to you, it's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears just to do it on your own. You're not going to get a huge amount of, it's not like, I'm not getting administrative buy-down time to work on this disaster plan. It's a lot of nights and weekends and just finding some dedicated people really to help you.
So I guess a kind of a loaded question. Don't you think this should become part of fundamental education, residency education, not just in surgery, but across the board? Because in reality, in these disaster situations, it's not uncommon for physicians to cross disciplines with their physician needs. And this should really become a process from the stop. And I would argue that I wouldn't even want to survey the audience right now of how many people have completed their FEMA modules.
So Sing, of course, my great internet cut out right in the middle of your question. So I think I got your question, which is, shouldn't this be part of the kind of standardized training of everybody? And obviously, I'd agree with you. I think that we're from a surgical residency standpoint, we're extremely stretched in terms of what we can shove into 5 years, and constantly get told that we're shoving too much stuff in. What we try to do with our residency is really to give them a little bit more, to give them as much exposure as possible. And that exposure literally can be, again, the extrication demos that we do. Or hopefully, we did have a program where we actually sent surgical residents out to just participate in an extrication course. And that was, one, it was a lot of fun, but two, actually the surgical residents then got some idea of what was going on in the pre-hospital field. For our AAST acute care surgery fellowship, now we have a pre-hospital elective for 1 month where we take them actually from dispatch all the way through community care medicine. So they do a little bit of dispatch, they do fire and hazmat response, they do ambulance response, they do some air medical, some USAR stuff, and then some community paramedicine. I think that the more and more that we can get people involved and active in it, I think the better. Again, I think it's just, everyone's stretched on time. So how do you do it and how do you get people? I mean, even this talk helps, right? We don't need to know, just have some appearance of what the National Incident Management System is great. You don't need to necessarily take your IST, 100, 200, 300, 400 classes.
Any other questions from the audience out there?
Dr. Fisher, Mike Gibbs, great to see you. Great job. Really enjoyed your talk.
Thanks, Dr. Gibbs. Good to see you as well. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I hope to see you in person soon. If that's the new conference room, it looks great. Y'all really did a nice job with that. It's fancy now. So hope everybody is well. Again, hope to see y'all soon, and thank y'all very much for the opportunity to talk today.
Thanks,
You have a
Peter.
great
Thanks,
rest of your
Dr.
summer.
Fisher.
Regards to Berlin and the kids. Have a great one. Thank you.
Yeah.